witnesses? Well, 75% of voters in a new Quinnipiac poll said witnesses should be allowed to testify in the president's impeachment trial. 75%. Broken down by party, that includes 49% of Republicans, 75% of independents, and 95% of Democrats. Meanwhile, 54% of Americans in this poll agreed President Trump abused his power regarding his actions in Ukraine, and 52% say Trump obstructed Congress regarding its investigation into those actions. So, Joe, we have Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, perhaps Lisa Murkowski on board for the idea of witnesses, Lamar Alexander, Pat Toomey, Rob Portman in play. One other senator, just to point out, Ron Johnson, the Republican from Wisconsin, who's been in lockstep with President Trump recently, said, yes, John Bolton should tell his story in a media interview, but not as a witness in our trial.
Oh, okay. Well, of course, that makes absolutely no sense, but that's what we've come to expect from Senator Ron Johnson. Heidi, you've got not only those senators saying there need to be more witnesses, you've got 75% of Americans saying we need to hear more witnesses, including 49% of Republicans, a majority in yet another poll saying that Donald Trump abused the powers of his office, a majority saying Donald Trump obstructed the investigation into his own impeachment. And yet we hear Lindsey Graham, the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, starting to talk about discredited conspiracy theories about Ukraine. I find this very interesting because yesterday you couldn't get a straight answer from 3 Congress people who kept going back to CrowdStrike and a Ukrainian conspiracy theory that had been discredited months ago.
Yeah, Joe, that was really stunning. I had a simple question, which was, what is the corruption that President Trump was policing from May when the Department of Defense certified those funds and said Ukraine met all corruption standards? And September, when 3 days after Congress started investigating him, all of a sudden he released the aid. And we went around in circles. It was an 11-minute exchange. And frankly, all of the other media who were there at that stakeout joined in with me in trying to get an answer. We walked away from it having no other answer other than that the president was tracking Burisma and the Bidens. And to your previously well-placed skepticism about this, Joe, despite those polls, Mitch McConnell made those comments that he didn't have the votes yet in the midst of a meeting where he was arm-twisting people to get the votes. And after that meeting, our own Leanne Caldwell spoke with one of those senators, Senator Pat Roberts, who said he was, quote, feeling good about the fact that they probably did have the votes to stop the witnesses. So keep in mind that some fundamental things have not changed here, which are that a lot of those vulnerable Republicans like Tom Tillis, like Martha McSally, like Cory Gardner, have primary opponents waiting in the wings, waiting to pounce. So you really come back to that same small, narrow group of 3 that we're watching. And only 2 of them have looked like they're sure on this, which is Collins and Romney. Murkowski did make those comments saying she was curious about what Bolton had to say before that arm-twisting meeting. After the arm-twisting meeting, we all chased her down to the bowels of the Capitol and onto the train where she refused to comment. So it's still very much unclear whether those votes are going to be there for the witnesses. And even if they do get the votes for the witnesses, Joe, keep in mind that it could be a protracted process, as there's a lot of ambiguity right now over what the president will do to try to block John Bolton, and that in the end, there's almost no doubt here that the president would be acquitted.
You know, Michael Steele, when I was a very young boy growing up in the suburbs of Atlanta, I would sit in front of the TV set every morning while my mother was still sleeping, and I'd watch a show called Romper Room. Oh, yeah. And there'd be this magic ball that the host would look into, and they would say, I see Johnny, and I see Sam, and I see Joey. And I'm like, oh my God, she sees me. They'd say, of course, say the most general names in the world. But anyway, but we can do this for Republicans right now, you and me. We can look into the crystal ball and we can see the future. And the future looks like this. 75% of Americans think that Donald Trump it needs the impeachment trial needs more witnesses. A majority believe he abused the power of his office. A majority believe, I mean, all of that said, all the polls say a majority of Americans think this guy abused the powers of the offices and obstructed justice, obstructed investigation into his own impeachment trial. But we look in that crystal ball for Cory Gardner, for Martha McSally, for Tom Tillis, for everybody in these swing states. John Bolton, this information, whether it comes out tightly confined in a Senate trial or whether it just gets blown out all over the airwaves over the next 2 or 3 months, that information is going to come out, which is going to include a lot of incriminating information about Donald Trump, which is going to lead to more incriminating information about Donald Trump, which is going to lead to an avalanche of incriminating information about Donald Trump. This morning, we're, of course, reading about attempts of Donald Trump to kill investigations into a corrupt Turkish bank and possibly even into Chinese banks, not banks, but Chinese entities for his own personal financial reasons.
Well, I
think these people are trying to kill this investigation now. Why don't we look into the crystal ball? How bad does this look for them the last week of the election when we know so much more then than we know now? And they're the ones who voted to stop Americans from learning the truth about Donald Trump.
Well, they're willing to take that risk because, again, these are players who play a short game. They're not playing the long game into November. And what their opponents, who are going to be well-financed, the Democrats are already outpacing Republicans in that regard at the congressional level and senatorial level. You have McConnell and others already, clanging the box on, hey, you got to get the fundraising going. So that's number one. Number two, you're going to have a narrative problem in the fall when your opponents, who are well-financed, again, are putting up ads that remind the voters that at a critical juncture, when you could have asked for more witnesses, where you could have helped the country resolve this in a way that we now see all the facts and know all the facts, you didn't. But they're more interested in the short game. You touched on a very important point, Joe, and that is they're looking to their right and they're seeing, I've got someone waiting in the wings who will pounce on me that Donald Trump could potentially support. When it comes to the question of corruption, I think the president gives us all we need to know when he says to his folks, hey, why do we need this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? Why can't we bribe people? Why can't American businesses bribe foreign governments to get what they want? So the narrative is set. And these guys are buying into the narrative of a man who has no regard for any of this.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.